I had never thought much about slavery before the day I met him. I was born in Charleston, into a family that had always known wealth. My father ran a cotton plantation, and the world beyond our gates was a distant, hazy thing. We lived in comfort, ignorance even, shielded from the harsh realities of the lives that sustained our way of living. But all that changed the day I came to know Kwame. He wasn't called Kwame when I met him, of course. He was called Sam, as if stripping a man of his name would make him more manageable, more compliant. My father had bought him from another plantation, his body scarred from lashings, his wrists thick with calluses from iron shackles. He looked at me, no fear in his eyes, only the quiet rage of someone who had known suffering beyond what I could imagine. Kwame was unlike any other slave I'd seen. He spoke little but carried himself with dignity, a quiet strength that seemed unbreakable, even in the face of daily torment. Over time, I found myself drawn to him, not out of some misplaced curiosity, but out of a growing sense of shame. I'd been raised to believe that slavery was a necessity, a way of life, but seeing the depth of his pain began to chip away at that lie. One evening, when the moon was heavy in the sky, I brought him water after a brutal day in the fields. He looked at me, sweat and dirt streaking his face, and I could tell he was on the edge of collapse. But even then, he refused to bow. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke, barely more than a whisper. "I had a name," he said, eyes dark with memory. "Kwame. They took everything from me. My name, my family, my land." It was the first time I heard him speak of his past. Kwame had been a free man once, a chief's son in the West African village where he grew up. He told me how they'd come, men with guns and chains, strangers to his land, how they took him from his people, his wife, his young son, how he'd endured the hellish passage across the Atlantic, crammed into the bowels of a ship, fighting for breath, fighting to survive. "I have been in chains ever since," he said quietly, though there was no resignation in his voice, only the raw, burning desire for freedom. In that moment, something inside me broke. How could a man be made to suffer so much, and yet still hold on to the belief that he was meant to be free? For months after that, I sought him out when I could. We spoke in hushed tones, hidden from my father and the overseers. He told me more of his life before, how he had led his people, how he had been a father, a husband. The more I learned, the more unbearable the guilt became. I realized that every ounce of wealth my family enjoyed was built on the broken backs of men like Kwame, men whose only crime was being born into a world of cruelty. It was Kwame's quiet strength, his enduring hope for freedom, that inspired me to act. One night, I made up my mind. I could no longer stand by while this man, this human being who had suffered so much, remained in chains. Under the cover of darkness, I helped him escape. We traveled by night, moving through forests and along hidden paths. My heart raced with fear, but Kwame was calm, as though he had always known this moment would come. After weeks of travel, we crossed the northern border. He was free. For the first time in over a decade, Kwame stood as a man unshackled. "I will never forget what you've done for me," he said, his voice strong, as we stood by the river that marked our final passage to freedom. But I knew the truth. It was I who could never forget him, the man who had shown me the truth about myself, the world I was raised in, and the strength of the human spirit. Kwame's journey did not end that night. He had his freedom, but the scars remained, both the ones on his body and the ones left deep in his soul. But even so, I knew he would never bow again. He would return to the man he once was, the chief's son with a name and a life of his own choosing. And as for me, I returned to Charleston, forever changed. I could never go back to the way things were. Slavery no longer looked like an institution. It looked like Kwame's scars, his suffering, and his triumph. And that I could never unsee. If you liked the video, please do well to like, comment, subscribe, turn on the notification button, and follow.